Welcome to Mass Culture's MC Minds, where we delve deeper into the intelligence of Canadian thought leaders in the arts. My name is Catherine Geertsema. Today, Christina Loewen, Executive Director of Opera CA, interviews Professor Geoffrey Crossick about his joint report with Dr. Patrycja Kaczynska, Understanding the Value of Arts and Culture, which was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. This edition of MC Minds is brought to you by Mass Culture, the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and the Toronto Arts Council. This interview was recorded following a presentation Dr. Crossick made at the Globe and Mail Centre, organised by the Metcalfe Foundation, OCAD University, the Ontario Trillium Foundation, the Toronto Arts Council, and the Toronto Arts Foundation.
And we are here with Professor Geoffrey Crossick talking about his report, Understanding the Value of Arts and Culture. This is in follow-up to a gathering held yesterday at the Globe and Mail Centre, hosted by a consortium of funders. This report is the result of a comprehensive 3-year study in how we value arts and culture, and it's supported by an Arts and Humanities Research Council grant. Well, first of all, let me commend you on what I see as being a real tour de force study that obviously and clearly has taken so much rigor and discipline and coherence to bring it to its findings and its inevitable conclusions.
Well, thank you, Christina, and thank you for saying that, because I know that you've read it properly. And I was actually quite encouraged by how many people have read all of it who I met yesterday here in Toronto. I must say that the quality of that report, which I'm pleased that you think so highly of, is the product of a fantastic collaboration between myself and the project researcher, Dr. Patrycja Kaczynska, who we really were equal partners in this work, and I think her contribution was really important to making it such a powerful document, because we brought different skills to it, which is why we're both joint authors of what I think is I hope a significant report. So thanks for saying that.
You're welcome. So let's dig into some of those findings, shall we?
I would be delighted to do so. I should just add one point. It wasn't just an Arts and Humanities Research Council grant. They took the initiative to set up this project and fund it separately. So it wasn't as if I actually applied for a grant and got it. It was rather they decided they wanted to put significant resource into exploring an issue which arts and humanities researchers and policy researchers in the UK, and obviously in other countries as well, have been thinking about and never making enough progress on. And so they decided at the most senior level, at the council level of the AHRC, to actually put significant money into a project in the last several years to try and make real progress. And they then invited me to direct it.
Thank you. That's a great distinction. It's nice to see that there's that kind of leadership coming out of the AHRC. You know, one of the main findings that stood out for me and that you definitely emphasized in your presentation was that, you know, how when we think about evaluating and understanding the value of the arts and culture, our definition of what encompasses arts and culture is far too narrow. So we make these artificial distinctions between commercial and not-for-profit arts and culture as though they are different things. The same distinction happens when we think about amateur arts and professional arts. So my question for you, my first question is, you know, how might thinking more holistically about what is included within the arts and culture umbrella change the way we think and the questions that we ask when we're trying to understand our value?
I think it's a really good issue, because when I started the work, when I was asked by the HRC to do it, I said, yeah, I'm really interested, but it's got to be the right kind of project. And that means 2 conditions. The first one, something we might come back to later, I don't know, is it shouldn't be a work of advocacy. It has to be an honest, research-based approach. But the second issue I said is, this is not just for the publicly funded and non-profit sector. And that's what most of the research that is carried out for arts and cultural institutions is for the non-profit sector. And the reason for that is actually takes us back to advocacy and the need to make the case for the arts. And something that struck me about Toronto in my engagement in the past, but also obviously yesterday at this fantastic event, which I really enjoyed, is the fact that I get the feeling, correct me if I'm wrong, that the publicly funded non-profit arts world very much operates as a world of its own. It considers its issues, it's concerned with its relationships and its art and culture, all of which are really important things, but it doesn't seem to engage enough in its own mind with those outside that world. I may be wrong, but that's certainly the impression I've got. And I think that raises problems, as it does anywhere, as it does in the UK, where there's a little less of an exclusive focus of the kind I'm describing, but still, it's there. And that is that the vast majority of people's engagement with art and culture has nothing to do with the publicly funded sector. They, as I said yesterday, the great majority of cultural engagement takes place in the home. Music, reading, television, streamed films, virtually all films are now watched streamed. We always talk about going to the cinemas if that's what film is about. And I don't think that focusing very narrowly on the publicly funded and non-profit helps us understand what the experience of art and culture does for people. And if the starting point of the project was to start with personal experience, understanding the value of arts and culture is about understanding how people value it, what they take from it, what it does for them, and then beyond that, what it does for society. We've got to look at all of art and culture because we did some quite interesting, funded some interesting research in which people who went to certain theatres and concert halls didn't actually know whether what they were going to was publicly subsidised or commercial. They bought a ticket. They didn't know. It doesn't matter much to people. Now, that doesn't mean the public funding doesn't matter, but I think if we're going to understand what art and culture does for people and does for society, we need to engage with all those experiences, including, therefore, also amateur experience. And there are vastly more amateur artists than there are professional artists.
This is data that we're actually familiar with in the arts and culture sector. There is a very well-known study that was conducted a couple of years ago called Culture Track Canada, and it's the Canadian version of a benchmarking, a consumer arts profile study. And the Canadian results very clearly told us that when we asked consumers, how they participate in culture, the participation statistics were really high, but they weren't so high for what we would consider our benchmark art form. So, the classically defined not-for-profit art, such as the ballet companies, the opera companies, symphony, theater, dance. People were defining culture as food experiences and music festivals, community events, things that happen in the home. These were scoring 62 to 82% in terms of their participation in it, and at much lower participation levels in the more benchmark art forms.
I think that when you're doing the kind of study we did, you have to draw the line somewhere, and we decided rather than spending a long time making making conceptual distinctions in what is art and what isn't art, what is culture and what isn't culture. And we worked in a way that's described as ostensibly. We simply listed all the different activities. So food, gardening sat outside the range, but an awful lot of other cultural activities that one would think do fit within the sense of the arts and culture, did fit within it. The critical issue is, and I saw that Culture Track report, that was really interesting. As I found really interesting, really excellent piece of research that was done on 3 Toronto neighbourhoods. About 5 years ago, that work was done. And again, people were asked to indicate all the cultural activities they engaged with. And it was an incredible range of things, even all within the framework of art and culture conventionally defined. Let me add one other point, because I could go on this one. Yeah. That is a really interesting, important question. I think the main point I would make is if we don't understand what the impact of engaging with art and culture is on people across the full range of their arts and cultural experiences, if we don't understand that, we can't then understand why some part of that overall ecology should be in receipt of public funding or of charitable funding. We're somehow setting the publicly funded and the charitable aside. If we put them together again, we have lots of things come out of it, and you might want to explore some of them, I don't know. But one I would point to is the notion of an ecology, a flow of talent, of skills, of interest, of ideas between the non-profit and the commercial, and with lots of amateur artists and makers actually fueling their interest in the publicly funded by their own practice. I know somebody who joined an amateur choir in their village, and they spent a whole year learning Bach's B minor, to sing Bach's B minor Mass. And she said as a result of that, she got so much more appreciation when she went to concert performances of Bach than she'd ever had before. And it's not that somehow competes, it actually fuels people's interest. I could go on about that as well. This is one world of art and culture, and the fact that organisational and funding systems break it up isn't something that should make us analyse it.
Let's talk a little bit about the funders.
Yeah.
Because, one of the most provocative questions that you asked in your presentation yesterday was who's asking and why? And I think that's a really great question to dig into because, in many ways, when we think who's asking, we do rely on the advocacy concern because, we feel the need to be able to justify our funding. And again, this is us just looking at ourselves very narrowly as the publicly funded strata of arts and culture. But there are opportunities to think differently about who might be asking. What if we were asking ourselves as individuals that create art, as individuals who produce art, as volunteers who support art, wandering through the cocktail reception last night and talking to different people and hearing their responses to your presentation was really fascinating because they were reinterpreting what you were saying through the lens of what they do. So I heard from artists, I heard from evaluators, I heard from board members and volunteers. So I thought maybe, could you speak a little bit about how evaluation might change or what we might expect to learn from the perspective of, let's start with, say, an artist. Why would an artist want to concern themselves with research and valuing the arts and culture?
Yeah, I think this is the question who wants to know and why is a really important one because we have a tendency to discuss evaluation methods, often called measurement methods, but I don't like the measurement evaluation methods. We tend to discuss it in the abstract. What's the best way of producing a template for evaluation and so on? Well, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Who wants to know the answer to what you found? It's true of so many other areas as well. So let's think about who wants to know and why. I think there are three categories of interest, three categories of people who are interested. First of all, there are researchers, mostly academic researchers, who are exploring a phenomenon because they really want to understand it and to publish about it and for it to be known. And that's one category. The second category is funders or other stakeholders who, on the basis of accountability, need to know that the money they have provided or the input they have made has been properly used and used for the purposes expected and was successful. The problem there is what's deemed successful is arguable. And then there's a third group who are always, not always, but heavily overlooked in all this, and that is your artist. I like to call it reflective practice. That is when artists, let's use the term artist, a very generic term, it could also include a theatre director or even a theatre manager through a whole variety of art forms, musicians and so on. For all of these people, contrary to what the claims for the arts are sometimes made for the arts, these people don't get out of bed in the morning and say, I want to have economic impact. They get out of bed in the morning driven by a desire to do their art. But they're driven by a desire to do their art in order to have some effect on others. It may just be the effect of experiencing something that is aesthetically deeply satisfying.
Or disturbing.
But then when we get disturbing, we're then moving beyond the simply aesthetically satisfying onto the areas where they want to actually make people feel differently, think differently, go away from the experience, whether they participate in the experience or simply were in the audience for it, to go away a little bit disturbed and unsettled. Not necessarily unhappy, but thinking afresh. Now, evaluation as part of reflective practice seems to be something that all arts organisations and all artists ought to want, not to do every day, all the time. That gets in the way. But if there is a new theatre production or a new art exhibition being put on, then the people involved in that should want to know whether the reason why they were doing it and the effect they wished to have on those who experienced it and participated in it was indeed successful, whether they got what they wanted, or interestingly, whether what happened was different from what they expected, but even more interesting. And I think that what has happened is that evaluations has come to be seen as something you have to do for your fund. And that actually gives evaluation itself a bad name and means that many arts organisations and artists just do it because they have to, but they're not very interested. If they did, and certainly a good number do get involved in reflective practice, but if they did think about reflective practice more, then I think we'd have much better quality evaluation, because it would be about what that art was about, what it was for, what it was doing, rather than simply the accountability requirements. And final point, I think what would be great would be to teach, not teach, wrong word, to persuade boards and other funders that these are the things they should be asking about. Yes, of course, that enough people came. Yes, of course, that the finances are in good order. Yes, indeed, that X percentage who left an event said they'd enjoyed it. Well, that's fine, but they should be asking more. They should be asking about what really happened and what difference it made. And at that point, reflective practice and evaluation will start coming together.
It's very interesting. In one of the Canadian contexts that I don't remember if we touched on in our panel conversation, is how the arts might respond to the truth and reconciliation process. One of the things that's always, I've never been comfortable with the idea of the hierarchy of research, the role of the researcher as being above and, quite physically above and distant from the subject. Even the language that we use to talk about the communicator and the receiver, we talk about benefactor and beneficiary. This language to me is very colonial. And I always think, how can we change the relationship between ourselves as practice-based arts organizations and artists in a relationship with the receiver of our culture so that it's more reciprocal, so that we're not only questioning whether or not our message has been received, but we're also looking back at ourselves and we're saying we are also implicated in this process and we have an opportunity ourselves to change.
I think that is a very important question. However, at the outset, you positioned it in relation to a particular Canadian initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes, I did.
Reconciliation process.
Yes.
About which I wouldn't want to comment because that's something I've not been involved in.
Yes.
I know it's important. I wouldn't want to talk about that because that's a dimension I'm simply not experienced enough about. But there's a broader issue about engagement with audiences. And partly it's about hierarchies of art form and partly it's about hierarchies of knowledge. And I agree with you entirely that there is a danger it's not a danger, it's a practice that happens, which is that those who generate knowledge professionally and those who generate new knowledge artistically have a tendency to assume that the recipients will simply be grateful for it and will appreciate it. I think a lot of artists are getting beyond that now, and a lot of researchers are, partly because there are increasing numbers of areas of research which are not actually about art and culture in origin, but often about social problems, mental health problems, difficulties in society, where the researcher not engaging properly with those whom they are researching about, the problems they're researching about, is actually quite damaging to research, but also damaging to relationships within society. And so I'm part of, I mentioned it yesterday, something called the March Network, which is a network established to explore the relationship between cultural and community assets and good mental health. And we're funding various kinds of small activities, sandpits and discussions, and it's absolutely essential and it's a requirement that in all of those there should be people with lived experience of mental health problems as part of the group. And there are lots of examples of that kind where it happens. We do it less in the arts, and that's an interesting issue because, of course, there is an increasing trend in cultural practice for people to break down the distinction between the practitioner and the audience. Far more engagement of audience, particularly in the non-public funded world, where all kinds of production now is going on in which the audience is part of the construction. So I think that art and culture researchers here's a challenge, they need to engage properly with those who are the sources of the knowledge and who are the recipients of the findings. But in doing so, it is essential that the standards of rigorous research are maintained. There's no problem in doing it, but there can be difficulties where that engagement actually involves a dropping of normal rigorous processes. But I think this is a challenging area, and particularly for evaluation.
There's a principle of a good socially engaged arts practice that says something along the lines of often it is the person most affected by the problem that is the best situated to present some solutions to it. And yet we often, not involve the people that are most affected by a problem in the decision-making process or the solutions-making process, I should say. And there's a tendency to solve problems on behalf of them.
Yes.
But there's something very powerful that can be, and transformative that can be released by engaging with the people who are directly affected by it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We need to, and all those involved need to remember and be aware of the distinct skills that people bring to it. The skills and knowledge that comes from the lived experience is enormously important. So the skills and knowledge that comes from artistic practice, from having practiced for many years, having trained. And I'm never enthusiastic about dropping those distinctive contributions and saying we're all doing this together. Because actually, what usually comes out of that is that the people there with the lived experience know that there are some people there with the artistic skills who are pretending they're not really, they're engaging as equals, whereas in fact they're engaging sets of skills. The important thing is to see all these skills and all this knowledge as of equal value in the process, even though it's different. But involving people with, go back to the reconciliation, but not to do with the Canadian setting, but with Northern Ireland. There's a variety of forms of particularly performance and theatre practice, trying to, the word used in Northern Ireland is not particularly reconciliation, but it is about reconciliation. It's trying to overcome the pain and the suffering that all people involved in Northern Ireland went through during the Troubles, wherever they were situated within it. And there are a variety of ways of doing it in theatre. Some of it is Cabbage Theatre, which actually is a little professional theatre company. They take performances into different communities. But there's also something called Theatre of Witness, which is where people who themselves lived through that and were involved in it, often as paramilitaries or as victims, actually develop a script and present it on the stage in a theatrical setting with audiences. And that's a very powerful part of that process. And it is people who've lived through it becoming actors and performers in order to both communicate, but also themselves think about what they've been doing. So I think it's a complex world you're describing, and it's one where an awful lot of internal respect is needed to make it successful.
And we have so much to learn in the world of evaluation. I had asked a question about evaluative capacity.
Yes.
And how one of the findings in your report was that, a lot of things that we take for granted in terms of the value of arts and culture is actually, not very well documented, or the research standards that have arrived at some of the conclusions we rely on don't really hold up. And it calls on us to develop better evaluative practices. And yet evaluation is a very complex thing. We're just talking about it right now. It's it's not just about the quantitative or qualitative aspects of it. There's developmental and there's arts based. And when you delve into the world of evaluation, it really does become a full-time preoccupation. So, but this is not what we're all about.
Exactly.
We're in the world of art making. How do we get better at evaluation while still honoring what our core missions are?
Well, first of all, I would draw a distinction between research and evaluation here. I think that the outcome of evaluations are the outcome of the evaluation. It may have been a poorly drawn evaluation, it may not be well enough undertaken, but it's not making claims of a grander level about its art form or its impact. It's research where in the report we're particularly critical of research which claims to have been rigorous and to have identified benefits from arts and culture, and which, in fact, the methods used and the research standards are not high enough. The biggest example that I always like to point to, but there are others as well, is economic impact. And by that, I do not mean the economic presence of arts and culture. And by that, I don't mean all the other benefits for the economy, like innovative people and vibrant cities that people want to work in, all of that. I'm talking about these very precise studies in which you calculate how much money is spent by a theatre. You then calculate how much money all those employed by the theatre and all those who come to the theatre and buy tickets and those who spend money in the bar and the theatre, and all that money.
Yeah.
And you then look at their suppliers and see how much money they have spent, and then use multipliers to come up with a huge figure, which is the economic impact of that theatre.
Multiplier.
And the fact is that serious economists don't take that kind of work. There are plenty of consultants who do it. What is often missing from it, even, it's not just that what is missing is the opportunity cost. What if all that money had been spent on something else? Could have had even more beneficial economic
the controls.
impact. But secondly, what a lot of the studies don't even do is take account of something called displacement. If you're spending money in a theatre, you're not spending it somewhere else in the economy. And secondly, dead weight. You wouldn't have gone to a restaurant that week except that you were going to a theatre. No, you probably want a restaurant anyway. So that expenditure would have happened anyway. Good studies at least try and strip that out. So I think that's a beautiful case of, and there are others not quite as powerful, but because so much is said about economic impact, one has to say, no, that evidence is neither very well drawn, nor is it actually very interesting. Back to my point about why people get out of bed in the morning to be an artist. So research needs to be rigorous and to be carried out in a way that meets rigorous research standards. Evaluation I regard as something different. They obviously overlap and they might use some of the same methods. But evaluation is an attempt by an arts organisation or a group of organisations or within a discipline, arts discipline or whatever, to actually carry out evaluation of their activities and to see what the impact of that has been, what difference it's made, and when their own goals have been achieved. So let's focus on evaluation. A real problem with evaluation is, I think there are two problems. One is the belief that quantitative methods are the only ones that are really rigorous. Generating numbers, that simply is unhelpful because most of the really interesting things we're doing aren't susceptible to counting. Or if they're reduced to counting, you come up with uninteresting answers. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be using quantitative methods where they really do give us meaningful knowledge, but where they don't, they're not. So there's a problem, is that quantitative methods tend to be privileged when actually it's qualitative methods, things that come out of all kinds of engagement with people, which could be actually interviews, it could be focus groups, it could be ethnographic observation, and obviously surveys are the simplest of them, the easiest to carry out. All those kinds of methods, and as you yourself said, you mentioned arts-based methods, really interesting to actually use art forms to generate people's responses to what they have experienced. All of that is really important. It can produce really rich knowledge for reflective practice as well as for funders, but many of those methods are very expensive and time-consuming. And I think it is really important that when choosing evaluation methods, proportionality should come into play. Proportionality in the sense of how important is it to get rich and detailed answers about this particular question. And one can imagine situations in which it is really important to do so and it's therefore valid to put considerable resource into it. But in others, you say, no, this was just one small exhibition we had in that space. It only was there for 5 days. We don't need to invest huge resource in it, but we do want to get some sense of what people thought about it. And that's where we come to the second dimension of proportionality, which is that it has to be proportional to the resources of the organisation concerned. A national theatre company has more resource to evaluate what it does than a small theatre company that does pop-up theatre in spaces where they only have their own venue and they have only a small number of staff and they bring together their team for individual performances. That doesn't mean the National Theatre necessarily does do the good evaluation, but there's a relative resource level. How do you deal with that problem? I think that for those organisations with small and limited resources, all have limited resources, but have small and limited resources, I think that the answer is, first of all, you don't evaluate everything you do. The danger is you do quick surveys on everything you do. Whereas if you have maybe 5 or 6 productions in a year, it might be much more effective to do a really in-depth and serious evaluation of 2 of them than a superficial survey on all of them. That's one way in which you help. Second way you manage the process is, I think, by, particularly for smaller organisations, to work with people in higher education who are thinking about these issues. There are an awful lot of arts policy programs in universities now, students looking for dissertations or work for papers. Those kind of connections could readily generate some actually quite professionally undertaken evaluations that a small organisation couldn't do for itself, so long as it's willing to really engage, rather than just get free study, free work done for it, but actually engage in that process. And the third other dimension, if I've said 2 already, of how you solve the problem, if I've said 2 so far. The third is the funders. I think it is one of the problems in getting effective evaluation done at all kinds of levels, is that when the projects themselves are being externally funded, whether it's external funding of an organisation or external funding of a particular production or a particular arts event, evaluation should be built in to the funding request and the funding given. It should be costed there from the beginning so that it takes place. And the funders need to see it as part of the responsibility to fund that. What everyone will say is, but that means there's less money for the art. No, this is money for the art as well. It's money for knowing how effective and how successful the art was in meeting its objectives, and I think that should be part of it, but it very rarely is. There are some arts foundations, I don't know if that includes any in Canada, there are some arts foundations, above all the Paul Hammond Foundation in the UK, which takes evaluation as one of its key priorities. And sometimes it just funds evaluation of cultural and social practice, but it always requires it to be part of its programme of funding, and it funds it. And I think that funders should take this seriously as well.
I'm glad you brought that up, especially the role or the relationship between the makers of art and arts organizations and artists, and how we might deepen our research and evaluation skills by working with the universities and the academics. One of the outcomes of your report is the establishment of this observatory of cultural value. So, one separate and distinct body that will oversee what's happening and coordinate things and build those bridges between the practice on the ground and those that study it. This is something that we're also trying to emulate or recreate or create, I should say, here in Canada through the Mass Culture Initiative, which is a very broad network. It's not just the arts practitioners, but it is intended to be a network that also includes the academic researchers as well.
Can I just respond?
Yes, please do.
Because, I think this is really important. We recommended in the report that something called an observatory for cultural value be set up. For reasons I don't properly understand, but in consultation with particularly people in the arts sector, the term observatory was not liked.
I could understand that.
Because it was felt as if it was from external observation. So it's now,
right?
it's interesting because I see observatories in other ways. The concept is meant to be a very neutral term. But anyway, so what has been chosen as the term is Centre for Cultural Value, which it's much less. It's just a term. And that's going to be located at the University of Leeds in England, and it will take on. It's not hugely funded, but it's funded for a 5-year period with the support of Arts Council England and the Paul Hammond Foundation, as well as the Arts and Humanities Research Council. I think that's really important. It's important to get this owned, not just by the research sector, but also by at least a body responsible for the cultural sector. It's not funded on a scale that enables it to do lots of research itself, but it is going to be, its aim is to identify key areas where evaluation and research needs to be developed, to focus attention on those, to draw together those who are working in this area, to organise workshops and conferences, to publish syntheses of work, and to identify areas where work is needed and yet isn't going on, whether it's academic research level or at other kinds of evaluation levels, and to draw that to attention of funders in the hope that they will want to have separate funding calls in those areas. It is to just try and get a bit of focus in this area, not unique focus. There are cultural policy and cultural affairs and cultural studies places, units in departments all over the UK as there are all over the Western world, but they operate often in a very disjointed way, often as happens with university researchers competing with each other, inevitably. The centre has no role in bringing them together by compulsion in any way. It simply can be a neutral ground where it's hoped initiatives can be taken and people can work together in these areas. And I think that one of the things which I hadn't thought of that, I'm going to be on the advisory board for this new centre. I just want to be more closely involved. It was time for me to step back, but on the advisory board, and actually what we've just been talking about, which is in helping cultural organisations, particularly smaller ones, to make connections with researchers in higher education, what is them, their graduate students, their doctoral students, to see whether actually there can be far more interchange. What tends to happen now, it's back to an earlier question actually that you put to me, is that researchers go out and they do the research and they take, with an organisation, take it away, and it's not necessarily a real partnership. But I think it's kind of partnerships that we're now talking about. I shall draw that to the attention of the centre if they've not been thinking about it already. It just means you just need to be a kind of an information clearinghouse.
Well, speaking of partnerships, as the Mass Culture Initiative develops, we look forward to partnerships with the new Centre for Cultural Value. I think there's a lot of learning to be had and exchange of knowledge. That's something that we're very much
I think that would be great. I can't speak for the Centre, but I will be talking soon, actually making a visit to it in a few weeks' time. And I will raise that because I know that one of the issues on their agenda is an international dimension for their work, partly provoked by the fact that I have, since the report came out, been invited to speak about it in so many different countries around the world, not just in the Western world, but way beyond that. And the degree of interest has really surprised and pleased the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and therefore they'd like the new centre to develop an international profile, maybe having an international, my suggestion was an international network of organisations actually thinking about these issues and interested in them, where they can share thinking and maybe occasionally organise events together. And I think
that would be great. This
between
is
Mass
cultural.
Culture and the centre, I can't speak for them, but
I can't speak for Mass Culture either. So.
Okay, then we have both made an absolutely strong commitment on behalf of these organisations. Great.
Professor Geoffrey Crossick, thank you for being with us here today. This has been wonderful. It's great to hear the results of this survey, and thank you for this interview. It's been great.
Christine, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed it. I was immensely pleased and touched by the invitation to come to Toronto, not just to give one talk, but to stay for a whole week and have lots of meetings. I gave the big event yesterday, but then there are other talks I'm giving, and I'm meeting lots of other people and organisations. And then this suggested interview came up, and I thought, yeah, it could be fun. And can I say, it was fun. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you.
To find out more about Christina Loewen and Dr. Crossick, check out massculture.ca. While you're there, join the growing MC network as a way of staying connected to cultural research. Thank you to the Ontario Trillium Foundation, who recorded this video. Goodbye.